In this video, I'm going to walk you through some very simple nodes to create your very first landscape. So let's begin. To create a landscape, we don't need the actual geometry of the plane. So let's go to the edit mode and get rid of all the geometry. And also, the landscapes are very big, so you need to configure the clip start and the clip end of your viewport. You can hit N to open up this panel, and in the View tab, you can set these numbers like so. And this particular object already has a geometry node created. And we don't actually need the geometry input because we're going to create the landscape from scratch. So go to the creator catalog, and in here we have 3 different creator nodes. We're going to be using the create landscape. This node will create an empty landscape for you, a landscape that contains no height information whatsoever. So this is a perfectly flat landscape. You can also import a height map from another application, or you can turn an object into a landscape. But for now, let's just create a new landscape from scratch. Okay. So this landscape is currently 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, and the resolution of the landscape is 128. It's going to be like this. And you can turn off the centered option to have the landscape positioned like this. Okay, but I find the centered option to be more desirable. And at the bottom, we have this viewport reduce parameter. This will reduce the resolution of the landscape within the viewport. While rendering, it's going to be using this resolution. But in the viewport, it's going to reduce this resolution to something else. So anyway, 128 is not a lot, so I'm going to just not use the viewport reduce. Next, we need to displace the landscape. And that is the work of the displacement nodes. So in the displacement nodes, we have some presets which kind of mimic some of the rock formation in reality. And in the core, we have the core nodes for the displacement. So I'm going to be using a simple noise displacement. And let's have a look. And one thing you should keep in mind is that the landscape will only displace up or down. Okay, it cannot displace in a diagonal direction like this. So if you look from the top, you see all the squares are still square. Let's have a look at the parameters of the noise. We have the vector input, which is the texture coordinate. By default, it's going to be using the internal texture coordinate of the landscape. However, you can create another texture coordinate and plug it in the vector. For example, I can do this, or I can do this. There we go. So anyway, let's just leave the vector empty so that the landscape will use the internal texture coordinate. Next, we have the W parameter, which will randomize the noise. We have the offset value to offset the noise. And we have the size of the noise. We have the details level. And we have the roughness of the noise. And we have the distortion. And next, we have this parameter to choose between the 2D texture or 3D texture. However, the default landscape is perfectly flat, so there is no difference between the 2D texture or 3D texture. So for now, let's just keep it as 3D. And we have the add option, which will add more height to the existing landscape. You can change this to, let's say, subtract height from the existing landscape. Or you can use a maximum node. And if I reduce the offset, you see, it's going to have a maximum mix between the new height and the old height. And also we have minimum, multiply, and divide. But for now, let's set this to add, because this is how landscape normally works. Next, we have the height information, which will scale the noise up or down, like that. By default, it's set to 500, which means that the highest point of the noise will be 500 meters. And next we have the center height. So let's set this to 1. And you see, the noise displays both up and down like so. And we have the offset, which will offset the landscape up or down. And next we have the normalized value. So let's have a look at the current landscape. All the vertices of the landscape were displaced up a little bit, and the highest point of the landscape is not actually 500 meters. Now 500 meters should be here, right? And the highest point of this landscape is only around here. This is because the noise is somewhere within the range of 0 to 1, and the noise value of 1 will move the landscape to 500 meters, and the noise value of 0 will not move the landscape at all. But currently all the values of the noise are somewhere within 0 and 1. So to force the landscape into the exact range, you can turn on this normalized parameter. So you see the lowest part of the landscape is now exactly 0, and the highest part of the landscape is exactly 500 meters. So anyway, I'm not going to use the normalized parameter because it's going to make things a little slower for the high resolution landscape. Next, we have the clamp mean and clamp max value. And let's turn on the clamp mean. This mean value will set the minimum value for the displacement. Okay. If you turn off the clamp mean, then this number will no longer have any effect. So this is the clamp mean, okay? And this is how you clamp the lowest point of the landscape. And likewise, you have the clamp max parameter as well as the maximum value. So let me lower the maximum. There we go. So we now have a very nice looking plateau kind of landscape. Okay, so let's get rid of the clamping and turn back on the normalize. Okay, let's have a look at the steepness value. Currently 1 means no additional steepness whatsoever. But if you increase the steepness to something higher than 1, then you will have some very steep mountain and very flat valleys like this. And if you set the steepness to something in between 0 and 1, then you will have very deep and steep valley and very flat top like this. So let's set this back to 1, and we will get to the mask later. Okay. Next we have the height channel. By default, the height channel, if you leave this parameter blank, it's going to be height. Okay. So having the word height or leave it blank it's pretty much the same. However, you can create your own custom height channel. For example, let's say H1 like that. And right now, after this node, the landscape is visualizing the H1 channel. But if you have another displacement node like this, okay, and you have a different height channel, let's say H2. So you see, we now have 2 different height channels within the same landscapes. And yeah, normally I don't recommend doing something like this. But if you want to have some very complex computation on your own, then you might find the custom height channels to be quite useful. So anyway, let me just get rid of the height channel parameter to use the default height channel. So let me set the details to something lower to have a very smooth landscape and make the noise a little bigger. Okay, now I want to add some more details to this noise. And I can actually chain together a bunch of displacement nodes to have multiple displacements on the same landscape. As long as you are using the same height channel, it's gonna work just fine. So for this noise, I'm gonna use something much smaller and also much lower noise like that. And now is a good time to try using a 2D texture. So if you set this to 2D texture, then this node will not take into consideration the height of the landscape. However, if you use 3D texture, then it's going to take the height into consideration while generating the noise. So depends on your purpose, you may switch between 3D or 2D texture like this. And let me just get rid of the normalize option on the previous noise. So this is what we have right now, and we can increase the details to have more natural looking displacements. All right, let's go ahead and add in a fractal terrace node. This fractal terrace node will terrace the landscape in a fractal fashion. If you set this to 1, then it will terrace your landscape once. And you can set the max size value to set the distance between the layers. And you can increase the iteration to have more levels of terrace. Now, 128 for a resolution is not a lot, so let's go back here and increase the resolution to 512. There we go. So you see we have a very nice looking mountain. Okay, now there is one problem. The terracing is way too perfect. So we need to break up these layers a little bit. So to do that, we will use yet another noise displacement. Like that. And this time I'm going to use centered noise. And I'm going to set this to, let's say, 30 meters. Or maybe 60 meters. And perhaps I should use a slightly smaller noise. So you see, now we have a very uneven terracing. So now we have a very believable landscape already. However, there is still one very important step, perhaps the most important step, and that is the simulation of natural erosion.